2,000 years ago, a single name shook the foundations of an empire. A provincial preacher, nailed to a Roman cross, left behind followers who risked death to sing to him as to a god. But here's the question that won't die. Did this man truly walk the dusty roads of Galilee? Or is he only the echo of faith, a story woven from belief? Tonight, the court of history opens. Rome testifies, Judea testifies, archaeology testifies, and at the end, you will decide, though the evidence may decide for you. Because if this man truly lived, then history itself and maybe your life can never be the same. If truth matters to you more than comfort, subscribe now before we begin. 1st century Judea, a land where faith and empire collided. Roman banners hung above the streets, soldiers patrolled the gates, and taxes weighed heavy on the people. It was a time of unrest. Festivals like Passover brought tens of thousands into Jerusalem, and with them, the fear of revolt. Rome's hand was heavy, and the high priests, seated in their courts, balanced between appeasing the empire and guarding their sacred traditions. It is into this tense, fragile world that the story of Jesus of Nazareth is set. But before we ask who he was, we must ask a simpler, sharper question. Did he even exist? Our journey tonight does not begin with theology, nor with sermons about faith. Instead, it begins with evidence. We are not investigating the Christ of creed, but the man of history. Was there truly a Galilean teacher whose words sparked a movement powerful enough to reach Rome within a generation? We turn first to our sources. They come in three families. The first, the New Testament writings. Long before church buildings or stained glass windows, letters were written. The earliest of them, from the Apostle Paul, date to the 50s of the 1st century, just 2 decades after the crucifixion. Paul claims to have met those who knew Jesus personally, Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. Whether one accepts the theology or not, these letters are historical documents, anchoring us close to the events themselves. The second, non-Christian witnesses. Roman historians like Tacitus, who wrote of a Christus executed under Pontius Pilate. Governors like Pliny the Younger, who described Christians singing hymns to Christ as to a god. Jewish historians like Josephus, who recorded the death of James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. Even a philosopher in Syria, Mara bar Serapion, wrote of a wise king of the Jews, unjustly executed, whose teachings lived on. These voices were not believers, they were skeptics, critics, even enemies, and yet they, too, bear reluctant testimony. The third, archaeology. Stones that still speak. In the ruins of Caesarea, an inscription carved in Latin names the very Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. In Jerusalem, an ossuary inscribed with the name of the high priest Caiaphas connects us directly to the trial scene. Excavations in Nazareth reveal simple homes and agricultural terraces from the time of Jesus, confirming the town was no myth. These artifacts do not preach, they simply exist. But in their silence, they testify. So here we stand, at the crossroads of history and faith, not chasing legends in the clouds, but weighing sources written, hostile, and carved in stone. The question before us is not easy, but it is clear. Was there truly a man called Jesus of Nazareth? If you believe facts should lead, and faith, if it comes, should follow, then subscribe now, because what comes next will test everything you thought you knew. For centuries, one question has lingered like a shadow. What if Jesus never existed at all? The claim, made by a small but vocal group of writers, is simple and shocking. They argue that Jesus of Nazareth was never a real man, but a story, a theological construction, a literary myth woven together from fragments of Jewish scripture and echoes of older religions. Voices like Richard Carrier, a modern advocate of this theory, insist that the earliest Christian writings, like Paul's letters, don't describe a flesh and blood man, but a cosmic figure. Others, like Robert M. Price, claim the gospel stories are too shaped by symbolism and Old Testament patterns to be history. To them, Jesus is no more historical than Hercules or Osiris. Powerful myth, yes. A real man, no. And on the surface, their argument grips the imagination. After all, the Gospels are full of miracles. The accounts differ in details, and outside Christian texts, References to Jesus in Roman history are few and scattered. Could this all really be invention? But here is the counterclaim. Virtually every qualified historian of antiquity, religious or not, rejects the idea that Jesus was pure myth. The consensus is striking. E.P. Sanders, one of the leading historians of early Judaism, calls the existence of Jesus almost indisputable. Bart D. Ehrman, an agnostic scholar, bluntly states, "The idea that Jesus did not exist is not taken seriously by any bona fide scholar." John P. Meyer, in his monumental study A Marginal Jew, sifted every tradition with rigorous criteria and still concluded, yes, there was a man named Jesus. Paula Fredrickson, herself Jewish, emphasizes that the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate is among the most certain facts of ancient history. James D.G. Dunn, N.T. Wright, Maurice Casey, across denominational and even secular lines, the verdict is the same. Existence, yes. Details, debated fiercely. But how do historians decide? They use clear, time-tested criteria, multiple attestation. When independent sources all tell us a similar event, it gains credibility. Jesus' crucifixion is reported in the Gospels, in Paul's letters, and even in Tacitus. The criterion of embarrassment. If a story would have been awkward or humiliating for the early church to invent, it's more likely true. A Messiah crucified like a criminal? That is not the kind of detail one fabricates to inspire followers. Coherence with the time and place, teachings, disputes with Pharisees, the role of the temple, Roman trials. These fit precisely within first-century Judaism and Roman occupation. Inventions rarely match history this tightly. Together, these methods form a historian's compass, pointing us away from fantasy and toward reality. So we return to the haunting questions. An invented Messiah, who somehow leaves Roman fingerprints in Tacitus. A myth, who somehow has a governor's name carved into stone. The mythicist argument creates noise, but the consensus of history keeps pointing back to a simple, unsettling conclusion. This man was real. What kind of evidence would you accept for any ancient person? A letter? A hostile witness? An archaeological trace? Write your standard below, then test it against what follows. The court of history is now in session. Our question stands. Did Jesus of Nazareth exist? Let us call the witnesses, not the faithful, not the preachers, but Rome, Judea, and the stones of the earth itself. Witness 1, Rome, outside Christianity. First to the stand, Rome. These voices were no friends of Christianity. They despised it, and yet they speak. Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian, writing around 116 CE. In his Annals 15.44, he describes Nero blaming Christians for the fire of Rome. Tacitus explains where they came from. Christus, who suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. A hostile witness. No sympathy, no borrowed faith. Simply history recorded in Rome's archives. Some quibble over his words. He calls Pilate a procurator instead of prefect, but such details matter little. The point is immovable. Tacitus, in a text untouched by Christian scribes, confirms that a man called Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate, and that his followers, hated and persecuted, still multiplied in Rome. Now hear Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, writing to Emperor Trajan around 110 CE. He confesses his frustration with this stubborn sect. He tortures them, questions them, and reports. They sing hymns to Christ as to a god, and bind themselves by oath not to crime, but to honesty. These are not legends. They are legal documents. Pliny was not retelling myths. He was interrogating living men and women who remembered a founder worth dying for. Add to these the shorter notes. Suetonius, who mentions disturbances in Rome under Chrestus, Marabar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher who wrote of a wise king of the Jews unjustly executed, whose teaching lived on. Not every line is clear, not every name exact, but together the chorus grows louder. Rome itself testifies. Witness 2 Jewish/Josephus. Next, Judea speaks. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, produced a vast work, Antiquities of the Jews. In 2 passages, Jesus appears. In Book 18, Josephus writes of a man, Jesus, a doer of remarkable deeds, crucified under Pilate. This text, the Testimonium Flavianum, has been debated. Scholars agree that later Christian scribes polished it, adding words of faith Josephus would never have written. But strip away the gloss, and the core remains: Josephus knew of Jesus. Even more crucial is Book 20. There, with no hint of Christian tampering, Josephus records the death of James, the brother of Jesus who is called Christ. A simple passing note, no sermon, no theology, just a Judean historian naming a man and his brother in the course of history. This single line is gold, because in it, an enemy voice, not a believer, confirms Jesus existed, and so did his family. Witness 3 archaeology anchors in stone. And now the earth itself testifies. In Caesarea, in 1961, archaeologists uncovered a limestone block inscribed with the name of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, the very man recorded as sentencing Jesus to death. His name, carved in Latin, cements the Gospel's cast of characters firmly in history. In Jerusalem, an ossuary discovered in the 1990s bore the name Caiaphas, the high priest who presided at Jesus' trial. The burial chamber of his family confirms that this figure, too, walked the very streets where the Gospels place him. And in Nazareth, long dismissed by skeptics as a legend, archaeologists uncovered the remains of simple first-century dwellings. Stone walls, grain silos, and pottery shards. The village was small, poor, and unimportant, which is precisely why inventing it as a backdrop would make no sense. Nazareth was real, which means the claim that Jesus of Nazareth was an empty title collapses into the dust. So here they stand, Rome, Judea, and the stones of archaeology. Hostile voices, reluctant scribes, silent ruins. None of them preach, none of them bend the knee, and yet together they say, yes, there was a man. His name was Jesus. If you've demanded outside sources, hostile sources, archaeological sources, this is them. Don't scroll past the receipts. Subscribe if you want more evidence-first history. And if not, at least be honest enough to comment why. After all the debate, all the arguments, historians of every persuasion, believers, skeptics, even agnostics, return to 2 immovable facts. 2 events so widely attested, so deeply rooted in early memory, that denying them is almost impossible. First, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Second, Jesus was crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate. Why these 2? Because they bear the weight of multiple sources. They are recorded in the earliest Christian writings, in independent traditions, and even in hostile testimony. But more than that, they carry the mark of what scholars call the criterion of embarrassment. Think about it. If you were inventing a Messiah, would you begin by placing him under another man's authority, baptized like an ordinary sinner? Would you end by hanging him on a Roman cross, the most humiliating and degrading execution the empire reserved for rebels and slaves? These are not the details of myth. These are the scars of memory. Historian Paula Fredrickson explains it this way: crucifixion was the Roman answer to unrest. During Passover, when crowds surged in Jerusalem, the governor Pontius Pilate ruled with ruthless efficiency. Rebellion was met with spectacle. Crucifixions lined the roads as warnings to all. Jesus' death under Pilate fits this grim reality perfectly. A myth could be anything: a warrior king, a conquering general, a heavenly angel. But history gave us something Rome used often: a broken body on a cross. Brutal, credible, real. Scholar E.P. Sanders went further, naming what he called the almost indisputable facts about Jesus: that he was baptized by John, that he preached in Galilee, that he gathered disciples, that his mission centered on Israel, that he clashed at the temple, that he was crucified under Pilate, and that somehow his movement continued and grew after his death. These, Sanders argued, form a skeleton outline that stands whether or not one believes in miracles. These are the solid stones in the shifting sands of history. And so, across divides, across ideologies, the consensus emerges. At minimum, Jesus of Nazareth was a Galilean teacher, baptized by John, executed by Rome, remembered by disciples, and spoken of by enemies. These are not the stories of faith. They are the baselines of history, and here lies the paradox. If Jesus were myth, why make him weak? If he were legend, why end with shame? In the ancient world, crucifixion was not a symbol of hope. It was a curse, a warning, a disgrace. No one invents a hero who dies in humiliation unless the humiliation actually happened. So I ask you, if a myth were engineered to impress, would its hero's public humiliation and execution sit at the very center? Why choose crucifixion, the most discrediting end of all? You tell me in the comments. The cross was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a timeline, one that historians can trace with surprising clarity. The earliest writings we have are not the Gospels, but letters, short, urgent, practical correspondence written by a man named Paul. These letters date to the 50s of the 1st century, scarcely 20 years after Jesus' death. That is the historical equivalent of interviewing soldiers who still remember their general, or citizens who still recall a king's fall. In these letters, Paul makes claims that bind him directly to the living witnesses. He writes of meeting Peter, one of the chief disciples. He names James, whom he calls the brother of the Lord. These are not distant legends spoken of centuries later. These are encounters within a single generation, grounded in flesh and blood relationships. But Paul goes further. In his letter to the Corinthians, he preserves a creed word scholars agree he did not invent but received. This creed speaks of Jesus' death, his burial, and appearances to witnesses. And the dating is critical. This formula can be traced back to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself. Imagine that, within the memory span of those who stood at Pilate's courts or walked the streets of Jerusalem, a testimony was already being repeated and preserved. Legends take centuries to form. Here, we find a movement proclaiming within years. By the time Paul's letters are circulating, something remarkable is already happening. The name of Jesus has moved beyond the borders of Judea. Communities of followers appear in cities like Corinth, Philippi, and Rome. They meet in homes. They share meals. They refuse the Roman gods even at the risk of death. It is this movement that men like Pliny and Tacitus encountered decades later. And what did those Roman voices report? Not admiration, not agreement, but frustration, anger, even hatred. Tacitus called them a pernicious superstition. Pliny described them as stubborn and dangerous. And yet, their very complaints confirm what mattered most. Christians were there, already by the early 2nd century, spreading across the empire, anchored not in a myth, but in memory of a man. And archaeology itself refuses to let the story drift into legend. The name of Pontius Pilate is carved in stone, reminding us that the trial before Rome's governor was no fabrication. The ossuary of Caiaphas speaks from the earth, confirming the high priestly family whose role is etched in the Gospels. The soil of Nazareth gives up its secrets. 1st century homes, stone tools, pottery fragments. Silent proof that the obscure village named in the Gospels was real, inhabited, and exactly the kind of place from which no one would expect greatness to emerge. Each discovery closes the gap between text and history. Each stone testifies that the cast of characters and the stage itself belong to reality, not to fantasy. So the timeline stands firm. A Galilean preacher lived and taught. He was crucified under Pilate. Within years, his followers were repeating creeds, gathering in communities, and naming those who had known him. Within decades, Romans who despised the movement admitted its existence and its source. And the earth itself, when dug carefully, whispers the names of the very men who stood against him. What does this tell us? That we are not chasing legends written centuries later. We are tracing footsteps that still leave impressions in history. We are following a trail that refuses to vanish. And we are seeing that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, was not just a figure of faith, but a figure of fact. If you came skeptical but the evidence surprised you, prove you value truth over pride. Hit subscribe. 1. Now we place the scholars themselves on the stand. These are the men and women who have devoted their lives to sifting evidence, separating myth from memory, and weighing what can and cannot be known. Each brings a method, each brings a conclusion, and together, their testimony forms the clearest picture of all. 2. E.P. Sanders, one of the leading historians of early Judaism, begins with what he calls the secure facts. He identifies baptism by John, Jesus' actions at the temple, and the crucifixion under Pilate as immovable bedrock. To Sanders, the very continuity of the movement after its founder's death demands explanation. Myths do not start movements rooted in real history, but a man can. And Sanders concludes, a real founder is the only reasonable cause. 3. Bart D. Ehrman, an agnostic scholar who does not write from faith, is blunt in his verdict. He calls mythicism a modern invention, confined to the edges of scholarship. Ehrman insists that multiple independent lines of evidence, from Christian sources, from Roman historians, and from Jewish testimony, converge in a way that makes non-existence historically implausible. For him, the debate is not whether Jesus lived, but who he was. For John P. Meyer, in his monumental work A Marginal Jew, applies strict historical criteria to every tradition about Jesus. His method is forensic: test, sift, discard. The result is a portrait of a marginal Galilean Jew who left behind a measurable footprint, not just in Christian memory, but in the fabric of Palestinian Judaism and the record of Rome. For Meyer, even a stripped-down Jesus still existed. 5. Paula Fredrickson, examining the Roman context, points to crucifixion as the most certain fact. Pilate's brutality is well attested, and his choice to execute Jesus during Passover makes political sense. For Fredrickson, the Roman reaction itself is evidence that Jesus had a public profile significant enough to warrant execution. Rome crucified real troublemakers, not myths. 6. James D.G. Dunn highlights the nature of early oral tradition. Far from being unreliable, Dunn argues that the sayings and deeds of Jesus were stabilized within communities almost immediately, carried by those who had seen and heard. This oral memory, close to the events, leaves little room for wholesale invention. Instead, it points back to a living voice in Galilee. 7. N.T. Wright, another leading historian, stresses that the shape of the early Christian movement can only be explained by a real public career. Legends might inspire devotion, but only a living teacher with a following could leave behind a movement that spread so rapidly. Wright defends more than existence, but here his point is simple. The existence of Jesus is the foundation. 8. Maurice Casey, a scholar of Aramaic, studied the linguistic layers of the sayings attributed to Jesus. He found patterns that point to Semitic origins, rooted in the language of first-century Galilee. For Casey, these Aramaic substrata make sense only if an actual Jewish teacher once spoke them. The linguistic fingerprints point back to a real speaker, not a fabricated myth. And finally, the minority voice. 9. Richard Carrier and Robert M. Price. These are the mythicists who argue that Jesus is literary invention, stitched together from scripture, myth, and imagination. They draw parallels to older religions and claim the stories were symbolic from the start. But their methods are sharply criticized. Most specialists dismiss their conclusions as arguments from silence or outdated comparisons. Their voices remain fringe, standing against the overwhelming consensus. Taken together, the testimonies form a pattern. Across faiths, across backgrounds, across methods, the overwhelming majority of historians affirm the same conclusion. Existence, yes. Details, disputed, debated, and argued endlessly. But at the foundation, the man himself remains. Every courtroom has cross-examination, and so does history. The objections come quickly, repeated across centuries, shouted on internet forums, whispered in late-night debates. Let us take them one by one. First objection. No contemporary inscription says Jesus lived. That is true. There is no stone in Jerusalem that reads, "Here lived Jesus of Nazareth." But pause for a moment. How many provincial teachers, artisans, or rabbis in first-century Judea have their names carved in stone? Very few. In fact, almost none. Inscriptions belong to governors, emperors, generals, and wealthy patrons, not to wandering preachers in small Galilean towns. But absence of an inscription is not absence of a person. What we do have are contemporary or near-contemporary literary witnesses. Letters written within decades, hostile references from Roman historians, Jewish accounts noting his family. And alongside them, we have the officials of his story, Pilate, Caiaphas, etched into stone and bone, confirming the context in which he lived. The world that killed him is carved into history, even if his own hand left no chisel marks. Second objection. Josephus was forged. The charge has weight. Christian scribes did add embellishments to one passage in Antiquities 18, polishing it with confessions of faith Josephus never wrote. But that does not erase Josephus. Scholars across the spectrum agree that beneath the gloss lies a core text referring to Jesus. And the real turning point is not that debated paragraph. It is Book 20, where Josephus records the death of James, the brother of Jesus who is called Christ. This short, passing remark carries the ring of authenticity. It was never altered by Christian scribes because it was inconvenient. It described the stoning of James, not the glory of Christ. And so, even Josephus, a Jewish historian writing for Rome, names the man and his brother in the ordinary course of history. Forgery cannot explain that. Third objection. Nazareth didn't exist. For years, critics mocked the Gospels by pointing to Nazareth, claiming the town was invented. But archaeology has answered. Excavations have revealed the remains of simple dwellings, storage pits, and everyday pottery dating to the early Roman period, the exact time in which Jesus lived. It was not a grand city. It was a poor village barely worth mentioning. But it existed, and ironically, that very obscurity argues for authenticity. If someone were inventing a Messiah to impress the world, they would place him in Jerusalem or Alexandria or Rome, not in a tiny, forgettable hillside settlement. Nazareth was real, and its very insignificance matches the unlikely origins of the man remembered as Jesus of Nazareth. Fourth objection. Romans never mentioned him, but they did. Tacitus, the premier Roman historian, explicitly records Christus executed under Pontius Pilate. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, describes Christians worshiping Christ as a god in the early 2nd century. These were not Christian propagandists. They were Roman officials and historians, often hostile, sometimes disgusted, always uninterested in defending the faith. And yet, their testimony stands. Within decades of Jesus' life, Rome was already writing about him and his followers. Silence cannot erase those lines. So, when the objections are brought to the stand, they collapse under weight of evidence. No stone inscription is needed when letters, hostile witnesses, and archaeology speak louder. No forgery can erase Josephus's passing remark about James and his brother. No doubt about Nazareth can survive the spades of archaeologists. No denial of Roman testimony can hold when Tacitus and Pliny leave their words in black and white. Cross-examination, then, only sharpens the conclusion. Not less evidence, but more. Not silence, but stubborn testimony. And so, I must speak directly. If you demanded cross-examination, you have now received it. If you asked for hard questions, they have been put on the table. Don't be the person who argues against sources you have never read. Don't cling to slogans when history has already answered. Subscribe now and keep learning. After witnesses are heard and objections are answered, what remains is the verdict. And history has its own standard of judgment. Historians are not theologians. They do not need miracles to make decisions. They do not require angels to step into the record. What they need is evidence. The same kind of evidence used to assess the existence of any other figure of the ancient world. The standard is clear. For an ancient person to be considered real, 3 conditions carry the most weight. First, early and independent attestation. The closer the sources are to the events, the stronger their value. Jesus of Nazareth has this in Paul's letters, written within 2 decades of the crucifixion, and in the early creed of 1 Corinthians 15, traceable to within just a few years of his death. These are not distant legends. They are immediate echoes. Second, hostile or neutral corroboration. It is one thing for believers to preserve a memory. It is another for enemies to grudgingly confirm it. Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, none of them sympathetic to the Christian cause. Yet Tacitus records the execution of Christus under Pilate. Pliny testifies to Christians worshiping Christ as a god. Josephus refers to Jesus and his brother James. These hostile or neutral voices are precisely what historians prize, because they had no interest in promoting the story. Their testimony is reluctant, and that reluctance makes it stronger. Third, fit with material culture. Stories may drift, but archaeology is stubborn. The Pilate inscription at Caesarea confirms the governor named in every account of the crucifixion. The Caiaphas ossuary ties the trial scene to a real priestly family. Excavations at Nazareth anchor the title Jesus of Nazareth in an actual settlement of the time. These stones and bones are not sermons. They are facts, and they fix the story of Jesus in the geography and politics of first-century Judea. Measured by this standard, Jesus of Nazareth clears the bar. He meets the same criteria by which we accept the existence of Alexander the Great or Socrates or Hannibal. None of these left inscriptions carved by their own hands. None of them have endless contemporary records. We know them through a mixture of near-contemporary writings, hostile acknowledgments, and cultural context. By the same test, Jesus stands alongside them in history, so the verdict is not mysterious. It is not miraculous. It is simply this: Jesus of Nazareth existed, not because of creed, but because the evidence meets the historian's bar. And so I ask you directly, given the same standard, which other ancient person would you now reconsider? If Jesus meets it, and stands as real in the record, then who else have you too quickly dismissed? A myth leaves only stories, but a life, an actual life, leaves pressure points. It leaves the names of governors, recorded in both text and stone. It leaves trials and execution methods that fit the brutality of Rome. It leaves movements that survive their founder's death, and enemies who still feel compelled to explain him away. Measured by the historian's standard, Jesus of Nazareth was not just a figure of faith. He was a man of history. The evidence stands: written, hostile, archaeological. On the terms of scholarship, he existed. And that is where the historian's task ends. But it is where your task begins. Because what you do with that fact, that there was a man who lived, who taught, who was crucified, and who left behind a movement that still shapes the world today, that is not a question history can answer. That is your next investigation. Do not let the evidence slip through your fingers. Do not dismiss what even hostile witnesses recorded. Do not turn away from the stones that speak. If you value truth above convenience, then let the weight of history sink in. If truth still matters in 2025, subscribe now. Would you follow the evidence even if it challenges you? Tell me in the comments, and share this with someone who says, "There's no evidence." Then ask them to watch to the very end and decide for themselves.